This little USB dongle promises to quadruple the speed of your compatible Razer gaming mouse. And that sounds like a whole load of BS, but turns out it's objectively true. The Razer Hyperpolling dongle allows your Razer gaming mouse, if compatible, to run at 4000 Hz polling rate instead of its usual 1000 Hz polling rate, which means that it's updating and refreshing to your computer 4000 times a second rather than the usual 1000 times a second. All the independent reviewers with their fancy sensors and measuring equipment has shown this to objectively improve latency and performance of a wireless gaming mouse when running at 4000 Hz. So problem solved then. Why am I even making this video? Everyone should just go out there and buy a 4000 Hz Razer Hyperpolling dongle for maximum performance to quadruple the speed of their gaming mouse. Well, the problem is that just because it does objectively improve performance doesn't mean that in real world use it's even helpful or notable at all. And it also doesn't mean that it's worth the potential disadvantages that are very real of running your gaming mouse at 4000 Hz, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But the first question I wanted to answer was, could I actually notice the difference in real world use? So I decided to do a blind A/B test between the 1000 Hz dongle that the Viper V2 Pro came with and the 4000 Hz Hyperpolling dongle and try to figure out if I could even tell the difference and accurately tell whether I was running at 1000 Hz or 4000 Hz. In Valorant, I basically couldn't. I basically got it right about 50% of the time in Valorant, which basically means I didn't know shit. And I couldn't conclusively tell whether I was running on 4000 Hz or 1000 Hz polling rate. However, when I moved to Aim Lab and I was doing a multitude of very fast-paced training activities like Gridshot Ultimate and tracking aim, I could actually quite accurately, about 80 to 90% of the time, tell whether I was running on 4000 Hz or 1000 Hz, which is way more conclusive. And I think that's actually the answer to whether you can tell the difference in real-world use. It really comes down to your sensitivity, your playstyle, and what games you're playing. In a game like Valorant, which is more slow-paced and more focused on large flicks, probably unlikely to tell the difference between 1000 Hz polling rate and 4000 Hz polling rate, especially since the Viper V2 Pro has something called motion sync, which was designed to help mitigate the problems with inaccurate sensor updates or inconsistent sensor updates anyway. However, when playing a fast-paced game with a lot of fast twitch movements, a lot of quick little adjustments and change in directions, like when you're doing a lot of tracking aim or when you're just flicking very, very quickly constantly, like doing Gridshot Ultimate in Aim Labs, the difference is notable in terms of how responsive and how fast and how accurate and how snappy it feels. This means that for games like Apex or Overwatch, you're more likely to notice the difference between 4000 Hz polling rate and 1000 Hz polling rate, whereas games with slower pace and slower flick types of aim like Valorant and Counter-Strike are way less likely to benefit from 4000 Hz polling rate. But wait, before you just go out there and buy a Razer Hyperpolling dongle because you play Apex or Overwatch and you're like, hey, this will definitely be a notable improvement, I need you guys to be aware of the very real world disadvantages that running at 4000 Hz polling rate does actually create, which might actually result in some situations where using 4000 Hz is actually going to be worse than even just using normal 1000 Hz. Now, the main disadvantage of running at 4000 Hz polling rate is that this increases the strain on your CPU a lot more. Because your mouse is refreshing 4000 times a second, you're basically putting a lot more work on your CPU every time you move your mouse. And if you are playing a very CPU-bound game, which most esports titles are, and you are someone who doesn't really have a super powerful CPU, you might notice some significant drop in performance. Also, if you're doing something that's really CPU heavy, you will find that you will have a lot of micro stutters and a lot of drop in frame rates. And I noticed it too. Even though I'm on a 12-core 24-thread Ryzen 7900 CPU, if I was streaming and using the 4K Hz Hyperpolling dongle, the frame rates were absolutely intolerable. They would drop from 200 to 40 frames per second if I was flicking my mouse really quickly, which obviously is not acceptable in a competitive esports shooter like Valorant. Now, of course, if you aren't streaming, the CPU demands are less, so you're going to have less of such severe stuttering and frame drop issues. And for some people who already have an extremely powerful CPU and doesn't stream or multitask at all, like with the 5800X 3D, for example, this won't be a concern at all. But there is also the concern that running at 4000 Hz polling rate will reduce the battery life of your gaming mouse. Because your mouse is refreshing 4000 times a second instead of 1000 times a second, battery life does take a significant significant hit when running at 4000 Hz polling rate, which is an inconvenience for some people that might be intolerable. On top of that, the Razer Hyperpolling dongle is another 45 Singapore dollars on top of the cost of the already expensive Pro series of Razer gaming mice. So it might be out of the budget for some people or just flat out not worth the money for some people. And furthermore, is it really important to buy this 4000 Hz polling rate dongle now, especially with such minimal advantages in real world use, especially since 4000 Hz polling rate is probably going to become way more mainstream in the future and become way more commonplace, especially with so many gaming mice manufacturers introducing this as a feature included with their gaming mice? I think the answer for most people is probably no. And there are way more important things in a gaming mouse than 4000 Hz polling rate, which brings a lot of hassle, a lot of cost, a lot of inconvenience for not much substantial gain. The thing is though, if you're a high-level esports gamer, or you're someone who is just a high-level player, or someone who just wants the absolute best in terms of response times and latency and performance, for 45 Singapore dollars, quadrupling the speed of your Razer gaming mouse actually doesn't sound that bad of a deal, since you are just buying an accessory to improve on your already expensive but excellent Razer gaming mouse. And with that, thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you found that video helpful or entertaining in some way. I know my tests aren't the most scientific, but everyone else has done scientific objective tests already. I just wanted to see, out of curiosity in real world use, if I could subjectively notice the difference. And it turns out in the game that I play the most, Valorant, the answer is no. So I don't plan to use it. I probably plan to sell it or something. Anyway, like and subscribe. Goodbye.
Two side.
Elbow.
Main. Hold for him.
Last player standing.
Get up. Nice.
I'm too good.